When TV host Greg Lawson mocked Pam Bondi's cross necklace, calling it trash, he never expected what would happen next. But in just minutes, Bondi turned the tables, delivering a response so powerful it left him speechless and his career in shambles. What did she say that shook the nation? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The studio was buzzing with anticipation, the atmosphere thick with the unspoken promise of confrontation. The Truth Hour was no ordinary talk show. It was a battlefield, a place where political and ideological wars played out under the blinding glare of the studio lights. The audience, a carefully selected mix of progressive viewers and conservative skeptics, sat on the edge of their seats, some eager for a takedown, others quietly hoping for a moment of truth. At the heart of it all sat Greg Lawson, the show's infamous host, a man whose sharp tongue and ruthless questioning had built his reputation as one of the most aggressive voices in liberal media. He was smug, composed, and ready for the kill. Across from him, poised yet unshaken, sat Pam Bondi, the newly appointed U.S. Attorney General under President Donald Trump. Pam Bondi was no stranger to heated debates. As Florida's former Attorney General, she had spent years in the trenches of legal and political warfare, her name associated with high-profile cases and fearless advocacy. But tonight was different. Tonight she was stepping into enemy territory, where the crowd was primed against her, and the host had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. She was a woman of principle, faith, and conviction, and she knew that Greg Lawson was the kind of man who fed off controversy, a predator waiting to pounce at the first sign of vulnerability. Yet, there was no fear in her. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer, her blonde hair softly framing her face, she sat with an air of quiet confidence. Around her neck hung a simple gold cross, resting just above the neckline of her blouse, a small but unmistakable symbol of her unwavering faith. Lawson had been preparing for this moment for weeks. His producers had gone over every possible angle, every potential weak spot, and they had settled on the perfect weapon: her faith. It wasn't her policies or her legal record that they wanted to attack. No, that would be too conventional. Instead, they planned to strike at something far deeper, something personal, something that couldn't be debated with statistics or political jargon: her religion, her belief in God, her identity as a woman of faith in the highest levels of government. The opening discussion was relatively tame, a warm-up round. They debated policies, judicial appointments, and legal reforms. Pam held her ground with precision, countering Lawson's rapid-fire questioning with well-reasoned responses. But Greg wasn't interested in her policy stances. He was merely biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to launch his real attack. Then, with the subtle smirk of a man who believed he was about to dismantle his opponent, he leaned forward, his voice dripping with mockery. "I have to ask, Pam," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Do you wear that little cross to fool people into thinking you're holy? Because let's be honest, you're just another coward, corrupt to the core." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the audience. The insult was unexpected, cutting through the professional decorum like a blade. Even the producers in the control room flinched, their headsets crackling as they whispered among themselves. Pam didn't move, didn't even blink. Instead, her fingers instinctively brushed over the small gold cross, as if drawing strength from it. Greg wasn't finished. Encouraged by the stunned silence, he waved his hand dismissively, his smirk widening. "That thing around your neck?" he scoffed. "It's trash, a prop, just like your so-called integrity." The silence that followed was suffocating. A few members of the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that the conversation had taken a turn that was no longer just political. It was personal. Pam Bondi remained still, her blue eyes locking onto Greg's with a steadiness that made even the self-assured host falter for a split second. She had spent her career fighting battles in courtrooms, in government offices, and under the glare of the media. But this moment was different. This was not just an attack on her character, it was an attack on her faith. an attack on every person watching who shared her belief in something greater than politics, greater than the fleeting power of television ratings. And Greg Lawson had no idea what he had just unleashed. Across the country, viewers were glued to their screens. Social media was already lighting up. Tweets and Facebook posts exploded in real time. Did he just call her cross-trash? This is beyond disrespectful. Pam Bondi better shut him down. In the control room, the show's producers looked at each other, concern flickering across their faces. This wasn't just a heated debate anymore. This was something bigger. Greg, still basking in his arrogance, leaned back in his chair, waiting for Pam to react, waiting for her to stammer, to stumble, to let him take full control of the narrative. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled. And at that moment, anyone who had ever underestimated Pam Bondi realized one thing: Greg Lawson had just made the biggest mistake of his career. For a brief moment, the entire studio seemed frozen in time. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Greg Lawson, still leaning back in his chair, folded his arms across his chest, reveling in what he believed to be a moment of triumph. He had just landed a personal blow on Pam Bondi, not just attacking her political stance, but something much deeper: her faith, her identity. He was waiting for her to falter, to look uncomfortable, maybe even lash out in anger. That was his strategy. If he could bait her into reacting emotionally, he would win. But Pam didn't flinch. She didn't frown, didn't stammer, didn't shrink under the weight of his attack. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. And that smile, it was enough to make even the most confident man in the room feel a sliver of doubt. "You're free to express your opinion," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "That's what the First Amendment guarantees. Just as it protects your right to spew disrespect, it protects my right to believe." Her words sliced through the silence like a razor. Greg's smirk twitched, but he wasn't ready to back down. He let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling his eyes as he leaned forward. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "Spare me the constitutional lecture." He gestured toward the gold cross around her neck. "You hide behind that thing, pretending to be righteous, while people like me call you out for the fraud you really are." Pam's fingers brushed the cross once more, but this time, it wasn't a nervous reaction. It was a silent statement. "You just called faith a fraud," she said, her voice calm, almost analytical. "You just told millions of Americans watching this, people of all backgrounds, all walks of life, that their beliefs, the very foundation upon which this country was built, are trash." A ripple went through the audience. Some shifted in their seats, others exchanged glances. Even the control room was in chaos now, producers whispering frantically into their headsets, sensing that this was quickly spiraling beyond Greg's control. Greg opened his mouth, but Pam wasn't finished. She leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable, but her words carrying the weight of years of experience in high-pressure debates. "You claim to stand for justice," she continued, "but real justice isn't about belittling people for their faith. Real justice is defending everyone's right to believe, even when it makes you uncomfortable." Greg's jaw tightened. The camera zoomed in on him, capturing the subtle shift in his demeanor. He wasn't in control anymore, and he knew it. Pam wasn't raising her voice, wasn't matching his aggression. She didn't need to. Her calmness was more powerful than any dramatic retort. Greg cleared his throat, forcing a smirk back onto his face. "Oh, so now I'm the villain for pointing out hypocrisy?" he shot back. "For questioning whether politicians like you actually practice what you preach?" Pam tilted her head slightly, studying him. "No, Greg. You're the villain because instead of having a real conversation about policy or leadership, you chose to attack something sacred to millions of Americans, not just me." The murmurs in the audience grew louder. Some nodded in agreement. Others whispered to their neighbors. Greg's confidence was beginning to crack. He could feel it. Pam leaned back slightly, allowing her words to settle over the room like a quiet storm before speaking again. "You sit here pretending to be the moral authority while you trample over the very freedoms this country was built on," she said. "You think mocking my faith makes you strong. It doesn't. It exposes your hypocrisy." Greg swallowed, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The producers behind the glass were scrambling, unsure whether to cut to a commercial break or let this unfold. Then, Pam did something that left the entire room stunned. She turned her attention fully to Greg, locking eyes with him as if she could see straight through the thin veil of arrogance he wore like armor. "Tell me, Greg," she said, her voice softer now, almost thoughtful. "If my cross is trash, what does that say about the millions of Americans who wear one? Are they all cowards? Are they all frauds?" Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. Pam raised an eyebrow slightly, waiting. The seconds ticked by, and still, nothing. She let the silence stretch, unafraid of the stillness, letting the weight of her question linger in the air. The cameras captured it all. The slight panic flickering in Greg's eyes, the way his fingers tightened around the arms of his chair, the beads of sweat beginning to form at his hairline. The audience was no longer on his side. The tide had shifted. Pam let out a slow breath, shaking her head ever so slightly. "Or maybe," she continued softly, "you attack what you don't understand, because deep down, you're afraid of it." The audience inhaled collectively. The cameras zoomed in on Greg, whose once smug expression had been replaced with something far less certain. The control room was in disarray. Greg was speechless. And for the first time in his career, Greg Lawson realized something terrifying. Pam Bondi wasn't just winning this debate, she was ending it. The silence in the studio stretched on, thick and suffocating. The cameras stayed locked on Greg Lawson, whose once smug expression had faltered into something dangerously close to panic. His fingers twitched against the table, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard, but his mouth remained shut. He had been in the media business long enough to recognize what was happening. The balance of power had shifted. Pam Bondi wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was dismantling him, piece by piece. The control room was in complete disarray. Frantic producers whispered into earpieces, debating whether to cut to a commercial break. But there was something electrifying about the moment unfolding on live television, something no one wanted to interrupt. Millions of viewers were at the edge of their seats, watching a confrontation that had turned into something far more than a mere debate. Pam sat perfectly still, her blue eyes locked onto Greg with a quiet intensity that made even the audience in the studio hold their breath. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't resorted to insults, hadn't let anger dictate her response. And that, more than anything, was what had thrown Greg completely off his game. Because he had expected her to lash out, he had counted on her losing control. Instead, she had turned his own tactics against him, using his words like weapons and forcing him into a corner he couldn't escape. Finally, Greg forced out a laugh, though it sounded shaky, uncertain. He ran a hand through his slicked-back hair, his fingers trembling slightly, then leaned forward with an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, come on," he said, trying to inject some of his signature arrogance back into his voice. "You're making this way bigger than it needs to be." Pam tilted her head slightly. "Am I?" "Yes," he said quickly, nodding, desperate to regain the upper hand. "I mean, really, Pam, are we seriously pretending that a piece of jewelry is more important than real issues, more important than corruption, than the law, than—" Pam raised a single hand, cutting him off. Not abruptly, not aggressively, just enough to make it clear she had no intention of letting him spin this into something it wasn't. "It's not about the jewelry, Greg," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "And you know it." Greg's jaw tightened. Pam leaned forward now, resting her forearms on the table, her movements slow, deliberate. She knew she had his attention. She had everyone's attention. And she wasn't going to waste it. "This isn't about a necklace," she continued, her voice calm but sharp. "It's about respect. It's about faith. And it's about something far more dangerous than you realize." Greg let out another forced chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, here we go," he muttered. "The persecution complex." Pam ignored him. She turned slightly in her chair, addressing the audience now. "You see, this is exactly how it works," she said, her tone shifting slightly, not just speaking to Greg anymore, but to every person watching from their homes, from their phones, from their computers. "This is how they do it." Greg's eyebrows pulled together. How, who, does what? Pam slowly turned her gaze back to him. "People like you," she said simply. The audience gasped. Greg opened his mouth to argue, but Pam didn't give him the chance. "You mock something, you belittle it, you call it trash," she said, her voice never rising, never wavering. "Not because you actually care, but because you want people to stop caring. You want them to be ashamed of what they believe. You want them to sit quietly while you tear down everything that matters to them." Greg inhaled sharply. Pam's voice dropped just slightly, each word sharp as a dagger. "But it won't work." Silence. Pam leaned back again, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "You don't get to dictate what faith looks like, Greg," she said. "And you don't get to decide what deserves respect." Greg's fingers curled into fists against the table. He had lost control of the conversation, and he knew it. The control room was still scrambling. The producers had never seen Greg this rattled before. Usually he was the one controlling the narrative, the one dominating his guests, making them squirm, making them trip over their words. Not this time. This time, he was the one struggling to keep up. And Pam? She wasn't done. "You called my faith trash," she said, her voice smooth, almost casual. "But let's call this what it really is." Greg blinked. "And what's that?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Pam tilted her head slightly. "It's fear," Greg scoffed. "Fear?" "Yes." She nodded. "You mock what you don't understand, you attack what you're afraid of, and deep down you know that faith, real faith, is something you can't control." Greg's lips parted, but nothing came out. Pam smiled, shaking her head slightly. "And that terrifies you." Another ripple through the audience. A stunned silence settled over the studio, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone in the room. Greg's breathing had grown shallow. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edges of the table. Pam let the silence linger for just a few more seconds before delivering her final blow. "You thought you could shake me," she said. "You thought you could rattle me. You thought you could use my faith as a punchline." She exhaled, then smiled. "But all you did was prove why it matters more than ever." Greg Lawson had nothing left to say. The control room didn't know what to do. The cameras captured everything. And across the country, millions of people watching at home realized they weren't just witnessing a debate anymore. They were witnessing the moment Greg Lawson lost everything. Greg Lawson had built his entire career on control. He knew how to push buttons, how to provoke, how to twist narratives to suit his agenda. He had humiliated countless guests on his show before, reducing senators, business executives, and even celebrities to stammering, defensive versions of themselves. But tonight was different. Tonight, the predator had become the prey. His mind raced as he stared across the studio at Pam Bondi, who sat composed, confident. Her blue eyes locked onto his with an unwavering certainty that unnerved him. The weight of her words still hung in the air, suffocating, unshakable. And Greg could feel it happening. The shift. The control room had gone completely silent. No frantic instructions in his earpiece, no desperate attempts from producers to steer the show in another direction. No one knew what to do. Greg Lawson, the host who had always dictated the tempo of every debate, had been cornered, and the entire nation was watching it unfold in real time. The audience was no longer on his side. He could feel their collective gaze bearing down on him, feel the disgust in their silence. Moments ago, he had mocked a symbol that millions of Americans held dear, dismissing it as trash. And now, he realized, there was no walking that back. Desperation clawed at his throat. He needed to regain control, to steer the conversation back in his favor. He forced a laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, come on, Pam," he said, leaning back in his chair, attempting to feign confidence. "Are we really making such a big deal over a piece of jewelry?" Pam didn't flinch. She simply studied him for a long moment before responding. "This isn't about jewelry," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And you know it." Greg swallowed hard. Pam leaned forward slightly. "You called my faith trash, Greg. Not just mine, but the faith of millions of Americans watching this right now. And the real question isn't why I'm defending it. It's why you are so desperate to tear it down." A murmur spread through the audience. Greg forced another laugh, though it sounded brittle. "Oh, please," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "You're playing the victim. You conservatives love to act like you're under attack when—" Pam raised an eyebrow. "Under attack?" she repeated. "Greg, you're the one who started this." Greg's jaw tightened. Pam continued, her tone never wavering. "No one came here tonight to talk about religion. This wasn't supposed to be a conversation about faith, but you made it one when you decided to take a cheap shot. And now, that you're being held accountable for it, you're suddenly uncomfortable?" She shook her head. "That's not how this works." The audience erupted in applause. Greg clenched his fist beneath the table, his pulse hammering in his ears. His mind screamed at him to regain control, to turn this back on her before it was too late. His voice was tight when he spoke again. "Fine," he said, leaning forward, trying to match her intensity. "You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about that." He gestured toward her, a sneer creeping onto his lips. "You wear that cross like it makes you untouchable, like it absolves you of every political decision you've ever made. But let's be honest, your faith is nothing more than a prop." The words left his mouth before he could stop them, and in an instant he knew he had just made a fatal mistake. The room went still. Pam's expression didn't change. She didn't recoil, didn't react with outrage. Instead, she simply smiled. A slow, knowing smile that made Greg's stomach twist. "Is that so?" she said, tilting her head. Greg suddenly felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down. Pam sat back, crossing her hands in her lap. "Tell me, Greg," she said, her voice soft but cutting. "When was the last time you questioned your own beliefs?" Greg blinked. "What?" Pam gestured toward him. "You sit there, night after night, attacking people for what they believe in. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself why?" Greg's throat felt dry. Pam didn't wait for an answer. "Faith isn't about politics. It isn't about appearances. It isn't even about people like you trying to tear it down," she exhaled. "Faith is about hope. It's about resilience. It's about standing firm when the world tries to shake you." Another round of applause surged through the audience. Pam leaned forward again, resting her elbows on the table. "You want to talk about accountability?" she said. "Fine. Let's do that. Let's hold you accountable for once. Because I think we both know that what happened here tonight wasn't just about me." She smiled again. "It was about you. About whatever it is inside you that made you think attacking someone's faith was acceptable." Greg's pulse pounded. He had lost them. All of them. His voice wavered slightly. I was just—" Pam held up a hand. "Greg." He stopped. Pam's smile faded, and her next words sent an unmistakable chill down his spine. "I think we're done here." The audience gasped. Greg's blood ran cold. For the first time in his career, he realized he had just been defeated. Greg Lawson sat frozen in his chair, his mind scrambling for an escape, for some kind of retort, some last-minute maneuver to regain control, but there was nothing. Pam Bondi had just said the words that would haunt him forever. "I think we're done here." And with that, the dynamic of the entire show had shifted. The studio, once a place where Greg commanded every conversation, now felt foreign to him. He could feel the weight of the cameras locked onto his face, capturing every twitch, every bead of sweat forming at his brow. The audience, no longer enthralled by his once dominant presence, was now fixated on the woman sitting across from him. The woman who had just dismantled him without raising her voice, without insults, without the usual tricks of political television. She had done it with sheer poise and unshakable conviction. Greg swallowed hard, forcing a nervous chuckle, trying to regain footing. "Oh, come on, Pam," he said, his voice strained but still laced with arrogance. "Are you really just going to shut down the conversation like that? I thought you conservatives were all about free speech." Pam tilted her head slightly, unfazed. "Free speech doesn't mean freedom from accountability, Greg," she responded smoothly. "You had the right to say what you did, and I have the right to call it what it was, an attack, an insult, and frankly, a moment of weakness on your part." Greg clenched his jaw. The audience murmured, their eyes darting between the two. He could feel it. He was losing them, and he was losing them fast. A voice crackled in his earpiece. It was his producer, whispering frantically, "Wrap it up. The control room is in chaos. Sponsors are calling. We need to shut this down." Greg ignored it. He wasn't about to let his show, his stage, be hijacked like this. He straightened in his seat, forcing a smirk. "All right," he said, folding his hands together. "Let's play this game, Pam. You want to act like a victim? Fine." Pam raised an eyebrow, stopping him cold. "Victim?" she repeated, her voice carrying the weight of a challenge. "You think standing up for my faith makes me a victim?" She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Greg, I'm not the one whose career is falling apart on live television." The audience erupted into gasps. Greg's smirk faded. He could feel his grip on the situation slipping like sand through his fingers. Pam continued, her words deliberate and cutting. "The real story here isn't about me. It's about you. It's about why you thought attacking my faith, attacking millions of Americans' faith, was somehow a winning move." She gestured around the studio. "Look at this room, Greg. Do you really think they're on your side right now?" Greg's fingers curled into a fist beneath the table. He glanced at the audience, but instead of seeing familiar faces filled with admiration, he saw something else. Disappointment, judgment, disapproval. People who had once laughed along with him now sat in silence. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. And then the final blow. Pam reached for the microphone attached to her lapel and pressed the button. "I think we're done here," she said again, this time directly into the control room. The screen cut to black. Greg's breath hitched. He heard the scrambling of producers, the frantic shouts in his earpiece. The studio lights dimmed slightly, and the usual closing credits music played over the speakers. The truth hour had just been shut down. Greg turned sharply to his producer, who had just rushed onto the set. "What the hell is going on?" he snapped. "You don't cut my show. This is my show." The producer shook his head, barely able to look him in the eye. "Not anymore, Greg." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Meanwhile, backstage, Pam Bondi calmly removed her microphone and handed it to a staff member. Her assistant approached her, eyes wide with disbelief. "Ma'am," she said breathlessly, "you just—" Pam held up a hand, signaling for her to wait. She picked up her phone and checked her messages. Texts were already flooding in, messages of support from friends, colleagues, even strangers, some from high-ranking officials. She took a deep breath. She had walked into that studio expecting a tough interview. Instead, she had walked out having witnessed the beginning of the end of Greg Lawson's career. Outside the studio, news outlets had already caught wind of what had just happened. Social media exploded within minutes. The hashtags #PamBondi wins and Respect Faith skyrocketed to the top of trending lists. Greg, still in shock, yanked off his microphone and stormed off set. But the damage was done. As he walked through the hallways of the studio, assistants avoided his gaze, whispers followed him, and the atmosphere was no longer one of respect. It was one of quiet realization. He had just lost everything. Pam Bondi, on the other hand, had just solidified her place as one of the most fearless voices in the nation. And Greg Lawson? His downfall had only just begun. Greg Lawson stormed into his dressing room, his face flushed with anger, hands trembling as he slammed the door shut behind him. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing. He had been humiliated on his own show in front of millions. The cameras had been rolling when Pam Bondi, with nothing but grace and poise, had dismantled his entire argument, reduced him to nothing more than a desperate man grasping for control he no longer had. He reached for his phone, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through the flood of notifications. His name was everywhere, but not in the way he had always envisioned. Greg Lawson faces backlash after attacking faith on live TV. Pam Bondi silences TV host in a defining moment. Sponsors pull out following controversial segment. His heart pounded as he clicked on one of the trending hashtags. Pam Bondi wins. What he saw made his stomach churn. Clip after clip of the interview replayed, dissected by commentators, praised by conservatives, and even defended by some liberals who admitted that regardless of politics, he had overstepped. One tweet stood out among the rest. Greg Lawson thought he could mock faith and get away with it. Pam Bondi didn't just shut him down, she ended him. His grip on the phone tightened. No, this wasn't happening. He had faced controversy before, but this was different. The backlash wasn't just outrage, it was consequential. A knock on the door made him snap his head up. His producer, Mark, stepped inside, looking paler than usual. He had a clipboard in one hand and a tense expression on his face. Greg, Mark started hesitantly, closing the door behind him. We have a situation. Greg let out a dry laugh. Oh, you think? He gestured wildly to his phone. I'm getting torched out there. This is ridiculous. I've said worse things on this show before, and now suddenly, I'm the villain? Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. It's not just social media, Greg. It's the network. The board just had an emergency meeting. Greg's stomach twisted. He already knew where this was going, but he refused to believe it. They're suspending the truth hour indefinitely. The words hit him like a sledgehammer. He staggered back, shaking his head. No, they can't. This is the biggest show in its time slot. We bring in millions of viewers. Mark's gaze didn't waver. Not anymore. The sponsors are backing out. 3 major advertisers pulled out in the last hour alone. And the board isn't willing to take the risk of keeping you on air while this firestorm is happening. Greg's chest tightened. What about damage control? I can go live tomorrow, apologize, clarify my statement. Mark scoffed. Greg, do you honestly think that'll work? You didn't just say something controversial. You insulted something deeply personal to millions of Americans. And Pam Bondi? She didn't just push back. She exposed you. She didn't yell, she didn't call you names, she didn't play the victim. She stood her ground with class. And now, you look like a bully who picked a fight he couldn't win. Greg clenched his jaw, fury boiling in his veins. So what? We just roll over? Let her win? Mark exhaled sharply. Greg, she already won. Silence. Greg turned away, running a hand through his hair. This couldn't be happening. He had built this show from nothing. He had fought tooth and nail to become a household name, and now, in a single segment, Pam Bondi had ripped it all away. But he wasn't going to go down like this. His phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. An incoming call from his agent. He hesitated before answering. Tell me you have good news, Greg muttered. The voice on the other end was grim. Greg, I don't know how to say this, but the network isn't just suspending the show. They're considering terminating your contract altogether. Greg's knees nearly gave out. What? You're toxic right now, his agent continued. No one wants to touch this. The network's stock has already taken a hit just from the bad press, and they're looking for a way to cut ties. You need to figure out your next move, fast. Greg's mind raced. This wasn't just damage control anymore. This was survival. Set up a live segment, he said through gritted teeth. His agent hesitated. Greg, I don't know if... Do it, Greg snapped, his voice breaking. I need to fix this. There was a long pause before the response came. I'll see what I can do. The call ended, and Greg slumped against the dressing room table, his reflection staring back at him in the mirror. He hardly recognized the man in front of him. The smug, confident TV host was gone. In his place was a desperate man, clinging to the remnants of his career. Across town, Pam Bondi sat in her office, her phone buzzing with messages of support. News outlets were already reaching out for interviews, but she had no interest in fueling the fire. She had said what she needed to say, and the rest would play out on its own. Her assistant poked her head into the room. "Ma'am, you should see this." Pam took the tablet from her, her eyes scanning the news headline. Greg Lawson announces live broadcast. "Will attempt to salvage career." Pam arched an eyebrow, so he wasn't giving up. A part of her almost respected the determination, but she knew this wasn't a fight he could win. She placed the tablet down, folded her hands, and took a deep breath. This battle wasn't over just yet, and when Greg Lawson took the air one last time, Pam Bondi would be ready. The newsroom was unusually quiet, save for the occasional whisper of producers exchanging anxious glances. The energy wasn't the usual high-voltage intensity before a live broadcast. It was something different, something tense, something final. Greg Lawson sat in the anchor chair, staring at the glowing red on-air light above the camera. His fingers drummed anxiously against the desk, his mind cycling through every possible way this could go. He had done countless shows, debated some of the toughest political figures, and dismantled his fair share of opponents. But never had he felt this unprepared. His producer's voice crackled through his earpiece. "We're live in 30 seconds. Try to control the sweat, Greg." Greg swallowed, ignoring the way his palms had begun to slick. This wasn't just another broadcast. This was his career's last chance. The countdown began in his head. 10, 9, 8. He adjusted his tie, squared his shoulders, and forced himself to breathe. 3, 2, 1. The camera light blinked green. They were live. "Good evening," Greg began, forcing a practiced calm into his voice. "Tonight, I want to address the controversy surrounding my last broadcast." A pause. Let the tension build. "As many of you have seen, my recent exchange with Attorney General Pam Bondi has sparked widespread debate." His voice remained even, carefully measured. "Some have accused me of crossing the line, of disrespecting faith, of—" He exhaled slowly, pressing his hands together. "Of losing sight of what journalism is meant to be." He shifted slightly in his chair, letting the camera zoom in just a bit closer, an old TV trick to make it seem more personal, more authentic. "And for that," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I want to say, I regret the way my words came across." Silence. Not, "I apologize," not, "I was wrong." Just regret. It was careful, it was strategic. It was the kind of statement designed to sound like an apology, without actually being one. But Greg wasn't prepared for what came next. The screen behind him suddenly split. A live feed had been added without his knowledge. Pam Bondi. She was sitting at a desk, her signature poise unwavering, her golden cross necklace still gleaming under the studio lights. Greg's breath hitched. What the hell was this? The voice in his earpiece crackled. "Network decided to bring her on. Didn't tell you? Good luck." His hands curled into fists under the desk. They had blindsided him. Pam tilted her head slightly, her blue eyes locked onto his through the screen. "Regret," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "That's an interesting choice." Greg's throat went dry. He scrambled to recover. "You regret how your words came across," she continued smoothly, cutting him off. "But, do you regret saying them?" Greg inhaled sharply. She didn't let him finish. "Greg, do you regret calling my cross trash?" The air left his lungs. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. His mind screamed at him to control the narrative, but the look in Pam's eyes told him he had already lost it. "You see, Greg," she continued, her voice steady, unshaken, "an apology isn't about how you feel. It's about acknowledging the harm you've done. And right now, all I hear is damage control." The newsroom was silent. The audience was silent. Greg's carefully constructed response was crumbling, and he could feel it. "Pam," he forced out, trying to sound calm, "I respect all religious beliefs." "Do you?" she asked sharply. "Because your words said otherwise." Greg's jaw clenched. "I made a mistake, all right." Pam let that hang in the air. "A mistake," she echoed softly. Then she leaned forward, her gaze cutting through him. "Or was it the moment the world saw who you really are?" A sharp gasp rippled through the audience. Greg's pulse pounded in his ears. He had been backed into a corner and there was no way out. Pam didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The sheer weight of her words did what no one had ever done to Greg Lawson before. It silenced him. Finally, Pam leaned back, tilting her head slightly. "You know, Greg, the First Amendment protects your right to mock my faith, but it also protects my right to call you out for it." And with that, she did the unthinkable. She reached for her microphone and turned it off. Her screen went black. It wasn't Pam Bondi who left the conversation. It was Greg Lawson, who had been left with nothing to say. The moment broke the internet. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Within seconds, the moment was being replayed, dissected, celebrated. Greg Lawson Exposed began trending worldwide. The headlines were relentless. Pam Bondi walks away, leaving Greg Lawson speechless. Lawson's last stand ends in silence. Career over, Greg Lawson faces unprecedented backlash. In the newsroom, Greg sat frozen, staring at the now empty screen where Pam's face had been just moments before. His producer's voice finally crackled through his earpiece. "Greg?" The voice was flat, almost emotionless. "The network wants to see you. Now." Greg swallowed hard. He knew exactly what was coming next. This wasn't just a bad night. This wasn't just backlash. This was the end. And as Greg Lawson stood up and made his way to that final meeting, one thought echoed in his mind. Pam Bondi hadn't just won the argument. She had destroyed his career. The hallway outside the studio was eerily silent, save for the muffled voices of network executives behind the heavy glass door. Greg Lawson walked with slow, deliberate steps, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew what awaited him. It wasn't a meeting, it was a sentencing. The door creaked open and he stepped inside. The room was filled with familiar faces, executives, producers, PR handlers, people who had once admired him, feared him, even protected him. But now they looked at him like he was already gone. A heavy sigh broke the silence. The network president, a graying man in a navy suit, folded his hands on the table and stared at Greg with the kind of cold finality that left no room for debate. "Greg," he said, his voice slow and measured, "we're pulling the plug." Greg felt his breath hitch. "Wait, you can't just—" "You did this to yourself," another executive cut in sharply. "You had years of dominance in this industry, but tonight, you lost everything." Greg's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "I can fix this," he insisted, his voice edged with desperation. "I just need—" "You need to pack your things," the president interrupted. "Because, as of this moment, you're no longer part of this network." The words hit harder than he expected. Greg had been in control of his career for so long he had convinced himself he was untouchable, unstoppable. But now, here he was, a man on the verge of total irrelevance. He opened his mouth to fight back, to argue, to plead, but then he saw his own reflection in the glass window behind the executives. A man who had once commanded audiences of millions was now a shell of himself. Pam Bondi had done what no one else had ever managed to do. She had taken his voice away, and in doing so, she had ended him. Elsewhere in the city, Pam Bondi sat in her office, scrolling through the flood of messages pouring in. Texts from supporters, emails from strangers, headlines blazing across every major news site. She had won. But she hadn't done it for fame. She hadn't done it for political points. She had done it because truth matters. A knock at her door. Her assistant poked her head in, holding up her phone. "Ma'am?" she said with a small smile. "The president wants to congratulate you." Pam nodded, exhaling softly as she touched the small golden cross around her neck. Faith had stood firm, and Greg Lawson had learned the hardest lesson of his life. Mocking faith may get you applause in the moment, but in the end, truth always wins. Pam Bondi's unwavering stand for faith and respect wasn't just about a debate. It was a powerful reminder that conviction matters in a world that often mocks tradition and values. Greg Lawson believed he could tear someone down for their beliefs, but he underestimated the strength of faith, resilience, and truth. This story teaches us that standing firm in our beliefs, no matter the opposition, has consequences that reach far beyond the moment. It's about knowing when to speak, when to defend, and when to let the truth speak for itself. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the importance of faith, courage, and integrity, then don't keep it to yourself. Like, subscribe, and share this video. Let's make sure the message of standing strong against hypocrisy reaches as many people as possible, because in the end, truth always wins.